Okay, this is Political Parties Element 3 about the two main parties that we seem to know the best nowadays in America, the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, as you notice on the chart, you'll see that the Republicans have a nickname, GOP. That stands for Grand Old Party. So when you ever hear about GOP candidates or policies, they're talking about the Republicans. In terms of political wing and basic ideology, let's remember, if you take a look at this chart here, that the Democrats are decidedly left-wing and the Republicans are decidedly right-wing. Now, what does that mean in terms of basic ideology? Well, remember, the left wing is more liberal. That's going to mean a little more control of the economy, higher taxes, and using that tax revenue to provide more social programs. It's also going to be more about being about change rather than tradition, more about second chances, and more about granting more rights and freedoms. The Republicans, on the other hand, are going to be decidedly more conservative, being on the right wing, and that, of course, is going to mean less taxes and more limited social programs. It's also going to mean being a little more traditional. It's going to mean not allowing as many second chances, and it's also going to mean not allowing total rights and freedoms. They're not against it, they just want it limited a little bit. In terms of coalition groups, we're talking about groups that tend to ally themselves with one party or another. Women tend to vote more Democratic. In class, we're going to discuss why that might be, but women tend to vote more for the Democratic Party than they do the Republicans. Minority groups also tend to vote a little bit more for the Democratic Party, as do the lower middle class and the poor. Now, the Democratic Party is more about change rather than tradition, and it's also more about raising taxes and providing social programs, which is why those groups may be attracted to those particular advantages. But if women and minorities are more commonly voting for the Democrats, you're often going to find white males voting more for the Republicans. You're also going to find that the wealthy tend to support the Republican Party more, primarily because of the low taxation. They get to keep more of their money, and they like that. And tax cut policies, even if they gave tax breaks for the rich, have long been a part of the GOP's political platform. Another group that tends to vote more with the Democratic Party would be unions. They're often about changing with the times in terms of providing more benefits for their workers, better working conditions. It hasn't always been that way. While their opponents, big business, corporate America, tends to side more with the Republican Party. Again, it's the taxation issue of let me keep more of what I have as opposed to necessarily giving so much of it to the workers. Another interesting point about this is the difference between the urban and rural groups in America. If you'll notice here, the Republicans are the red counties in Texas here, the Democrats are the blue counties, and you'll notice around Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, Houston, the big urban areas, the Democrats typically took those counties, while the Republicans typically took the rural areas. Now, this is primarily because there are a lot of unions in cities, and also because cities are a little more modern and a little more apt to change with the times. Rural areas tend to be a lot more traditional, and therefore the rural areas tend to support the Republicans. As a result, because of traditional values, farmers are often big advocates of the Republican Party. Again, this is based on traditionalism, this is based on conservative values, and let's not forget, if you live in rural areas and you like to hunt, the right to bear arms, which conservatives are very, very big on as well. You're also going to find that people in higher education, like master's degree or above, are generally going to vote more for the Democratic Party. This is probably the result of a general liberal feel that has taken place on college campuses for most of America's history. Now, in terms of a family tree and a birthday and a birthplace, the Democratic Party is basically an offshoot of the old Democratic Republican Party, which had come from the Anti-Federalists. They basically are born in New York in 1828. while the Republican Party came from the old Whig Party, which had come from the Federalists. But the reason I have this slide in front of you is because of the story of where the Republican Party was born. Now, no matter how you look at it, it was born in 1854, but Ripon, Wisconsin likes to make the claim that they're the birthplace of the Republican Party because they had the anti-Nebraska slavery meeting there and suggested it as a name. That was on March 20th, 1854. Meanwhile, in July of that same year, a rally was held in Jackson, Michigan, and that's the first time they officially used the name Republican Party. So both towns make claim to being the birthplace of the Republican Party. The Democrats have as their symbol the donkey, and it's primarily because their founder, Andrew Jackson, was often portrayed in political cartoons as being a, pardon me for saying this, jackass. Meanwhile, the Republicans have always been characterized by the elephant, as you can see over here. This is because of a political cartoon drawn by Thomas Nast that was celebrating Republican victories in recent congressional elections. The elephant was trumpeting the sound of the recent Republican victory. Republicans liked the idea so much that they decided to keep it, while the Democrats, of course, were still being known by the donkey symbol. The color of the Democratic Party is blue, while the color of the Republican Party is red, and you often hear about the blue states trying to gain votes in the red states and vice versa. Well, with the red and the blue, that's what they're talking about. And as you can see on this chart, red and blue are routinely used to show all sorts of indications. You really don't need an R or a D anymore. You just look at the color to determine who the Democrats are and the Republicans are. As far as dominant eras in history, the Democrats held the presidency for most of the elections from 1828 until the Civil War, which started in 1861, but they really wouldn't touch the presidency again until 1932. After the Civil War, they only had 2 Democratic presidents. In 1932, they dominate the presidency again all the way up to 1968. Being helped along by 4 elected terms for Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Republicans, meanwhile, dominate the presidency from the Civil War all the way up to 1932. This is primarily in part because the Republicans had been the ones who freed the slaves, and once former slaves had the right to vote, they just kept electing former Union generals all the way up to 1900, and the Republicans just kept going from there. As a result, if you were a Democratic candidate from the Civil War all the way up to 1968 even, you could count on southern states voting for you. They were always going to vote Democrat because the Republicans had been the ones that freed the slaves. It's called the Solid South in American political history, the idea that a Democrat could count on just about the entire South to vote for him. Some of the more famous Democratic presidents include Andrew Jackson, Franklin Roosevelt, famous for the New Deal and being the president in World War II. Harry Truman, who was FDR's vice president and was famous for dropping the atomic bombs on Japan. John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960, the first Catholic to be elected president. His vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who was in charge during the Vietnam War. Jimmy Carter, with one of the largest smiles of any president ever. And Bill Clinton, who got elected in 1992 and again in 1996. He was the president for most of the 90s. Often referred to as Slick Willie for the way that the Republicans would come after him, and it all seemed to slip off him and never get him convicted of anything. This political cartoon is kind of funny, as you can see here. Bill Clinton is supposed to get hanged, and the trapdoor drops, and the Republican elephant is the one that somehow ends up in the noose asking, how does he do this? And of course, Barack Obama is also a Democrat. When you're talking about Republican presidents, you have to, of course, start with the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, president during the Civil War. The time period after the Civil War, even though it's dominated by Republican presidents, is often known as the age of the Forgettable Presidents because it was viewed that people like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie had the presidents in their hip pocket and could do whatever they wanted to do with the hands-off the business policies of the Republican presidents of that time. That all came to an end with another Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, who went after the big business trusts and broke them up, or was given credit for it anyway, and is also famous for giving us teddy bears. He had come across 3 bear cubs while hunting, and toy stores started producing little bears named after Teddy Roosevelt. Following Roosevelt was another Republican president, 350-pound William Howard Taft, who once got stuck in his own bathtub and had to be buttered out. This is the replacement tub that was put in for him. But Taft is also famous for being the only president to leave the office and eventually become Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Calvin Coolidge, who kept his hands off the economy during the Roaring Twenties. Herbert Hoover, who will probably always be known as the guy who was president when the stock market crash happened in 1929, starting the Great Depression. Dwight D. Eisenhower for basically all of the 1950s. Richard Nixon, who's probably most famous for the Watergate scandal. And Gerald Ford, who's famous for being the only president who was never elected president or vice president by the American people. Nixon's vice president had gotten involved in a tax evasion scandal, and so Jerry Ford was appointed vice president. And when Nixon got busted for Watergate, Ford moved up to the presidency, having never been elected to either office. Ronald Reagan, who turned the 1980s into the conservative revolution by cutting more taxes than any president in history ever had. His vice president, George Bush, who continued on with Reagan's policies. And George Bush's son, George W. Bush, who got elected in 2000. But contrary to popular belief, the Republicans and the Democrats are not the only 2 political parties in America. We actually have close to 1,000 political parties if you really want to count them all up, and these minor parties are always trying to crash the party, if you will, trying to have more influence in American politics. It's just that the Republicans and the Democrats are the ones with all the money and the resources, while the minor parties essentially have, a log. If you're not interested in being a Republican or a Democrat, you could choose to be an independent or a socialist or a member of the Green Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, the Labor Party, the Libertarian Party. There are, in fact, all sorts of political parties that you could choose to be a part of. I've heard of the Aloha Party, which seeks out Hawaiian independence, and the Alaskan Nationalist Party, and various marijuana parties, and new prohibition parties, and everything along those lines. On the right wing, you can often find the Libertarian Party, and you can also, on the left wing, find the Green Party and the Socialist Party, all promoting left-wing and right-wing issues. The Green Party typically is what is known as a single-issue party, really just concerned with the environment more than anything else. While the Democratic Socialists are kind of waiting for the day when we can be more like Canada and have a democratic government with full-on socialist economics and tax rates up in the 50% range. But the political party that's kind of come out of nowhere is the Tea Party, which basically is a right-wing party that claims to be Republican, but frankly, it's closer to the Libertarian Party. Remember that the Libertarians don't like people in their wallet, and they don't like people in their rights. And that's really more of what the Tea Party is about. They're a little bit more extreme than your standard Republican. And that kind of always seems to be the case with minor parties. They really don't ever win elections as much as they take votes away from groups with similar ideologies. The Green Party tends to take votes away from the Democratic Party, and the Tea Party tends to take votes away from the Republican Party. But in terms of the influence of third parties, there's really only 4 types, and how they form. You first of all have splinter parties, like Teddy Roosevelt's old Bull Moose Party. He disagreed with the Republicans, so he broke away from them. You have single-issue parties, like the Green Party, that's just concerned with the environment, or ideological parties that are the Tea Party movement. You also have extremist parties like the Fascist Party or the Communist Party. And then you have individual political parties that really aren't associated with anyone or anything in particular.